I'm Vinny Politan. Thanks so much for joining us here tonight on Closing Arguments. And Friday on this program and Friday in Minneapolis, the big headline was all about the $27 million civil settlement that the city of Minneapolis agreed to with the family of George Floyd. And civil settlement is the key word there because it's a civil case. It was a civil lawsuit. It had a lot to do factually with what we're dealing with here in the criminal case, but was a completely different case in front of, and would have been in front of a different judge in a different courtroom with different parties associated with it, different burden of proof, all of that, and ultimately was about something different when it comes to this settlement and conclusion of the case. The civil case, $27 million. The criminal case about whether or not Derek Chauvin will spend time in prison for murdering George Floyd. So while they are different, yeah, they're about the same thing that happened, obviously, right? So there is that sort of crossover and cross-section of the two cases. But one does not control the other. What happens in the civil case does not control the criminal case. But that big headline can impact the criminal case. At least that's what the defense is afraid of now, that all this publicity and this admission by the city of Minneapolis that George Floyd was wrongfully killed that day. That's what that settlement says in a very loud way with the number of 27 million. So that big headline from Friday became big news inside the courtroom first thing this morning and became my biggest moment of the day.
When George Floyd was horrifically killed on May 25th, 2020, it was a watershed moment for America. It's not just historic because of the $27 million paid out, but for the impact on social justice, policy reforms, and police reforms.
I think the number 27 million is historic. It's unprecedented. And I think it's a good wake-up call for a lot of municipalities around the country to know that if they don't police their police, if they fail to discipline their police, if they don't have accountability and transparency, there are going to be consequences.
By my count, this is the third highly prejudicial and incredibly prejudicial press leak or press release that has very suspicious timing, to say the least. Has an incredible propensity to taint a jury pool. Because what we've been hearing from the jurors who've come in so far is they may run into a headline record $27 million civil settlement. If there's, and the court has granted permission for these people to be scrolling through Facebook, it's going to be unavoidable.
With respect to the actual news of the $27 million settlement, all I can say to the court is there are some things that the state of Minnesota and this prosecution team can control, and there's some things that the state cannot and does not control. But we cannot and do not control the civil aspect of the case. We cannot and do not control the Minneapolis City Council.
I wish people would, city officials would stop talking about this case so much, but at the same time, I don't find any evil intent that they are trying to tamper with this criminal case.
You know, I don't know if it was purposely done, but I don't believe in coincidences. I mean, that's one thing I've learned in covering the law and crime and justice and our system of justice. I don't think all of this was necessarily a coincidence that the announcement was made very publicly in the middle of jury selection. But let's bring in Court TV legal correspondent Julie Janae, who is in Minneapolis and joins us live tonight. Julia, first of all, tell me how big this played in Minneapolis, right? Because you're staying there. That's where you are. You know, you wake up. I don't know, maybe you watch local TV for a minute before you turn back on Court TV to watch, you know, replays of us. But seriously, how big did this civil settlement play locally where you are?
This really was the top news of the day. It was everywhere. I was getting alerts from the local media here. You heard people talking about it. I was getting texts from the sources that I have here on the ground in Minneapolis. So it was the top news, and people were still talking about it through the weekend. So not unusual that it would come up in court because it was so pervasive through the news cycle here in Minneapolis. But one of the things the state tried to bring up at the end of those arguments back and forth was that even though it was big news here, it was also big news nationally. So moving the trial, which is something the defense tossed as a possible remedy to this, that it wouldn't make a difference because it was big news everywhere.
Yeah, we're not moving the trial. You know, here's the big headline. We're not moving this trial. We've already got nine jurors, and obviously, you know, you may have to talk to the other 7 about this if they heard anything, or if they heard anything else as well. I mean, it's a continuing process with jurors. I mean, every day, right, Julia, when we cover a trial, isn't that the first thing the judges do in the morning? Did you see anything? Did you hear anything? Did anyone talk to you? Did you inadvertently hear anything? And that's just standard operating procedures for trials.
Every day, after every break, after every lunch, even if they just went to the bathroom, when they come back, the judge asks them, hey, when you got on the phone, did you see anything that possibly has changed your opinion, or did you see anything that you weren't supposed to? Are you following my instructions? So we know that those 7 jurors that were already seated that they weren't able to ask those questions of, the judge will allow them to be revoir dire. They'll be able to ask those questions again before this trial starts.
Right, and you're not going to ask them, hey, did you hear about the $27 million settlement? There'll be other ways, I think, more subtly to ask them to see if they heard anything about it. All right, let's take a listen to Eric Nelson, because I'm sure he was surprised, maybe blindsided a little bit by all of this happening, and then kind of threw out some accusations for the people who were responsible for the settlement. Not the attorneys for the family of George Floyd, but the folks from Minneapolis who control the ability to pay that money. Let's take a listen.
We've got a mayor who's a lawyer by trade. He should know better, Your Honor. And obviously, Mr. Ellison's son is a city council member. And I'm not accusing Mr. Ellison of anything. I just want to make that very clear. But it is, you know, it is profoundly disturbing to the defense, because ultimately the goal of this system is to provide a fair trial. And this is not fair.
Like I say, I think it is unfortunate. We're going to continue to proceed for now. I am taking your motion for a continuance of the trial date under advisement, however.
You know, Julia, this judge has done a great job of keeping everything on track, but I think he seemed like, wow, this should not have happened. You know, he says it, and I think in this tone, reading it a little bit, he was a little bit upset that this happened.
He did seem that this was more of a concern than something neutral. He said that he wished that city officials would stop talking about this case. And we know Judge Cahill has said repeatedly he's not continuing this case. This is the first time, it seems, that he's actually considering possibly delaying this trial because of this news and how pervasive it is. And what we heard from the potential jurors, at least one of them today, about the settlement news reaching them.
Let's listen to that juror, number 51.
Of understanding more on the civil side, and I work in human resources, so I work with unemployment insurance, appeals and hearings and judges and such. Generally, the preponderance of the evidence in civil cases leans towards guilt. My guess is that with that large of a settlement, that the city felt that they would not prevail in civil courts and therefore didn't feel like they could make a case to overcome the preponderance of evidence.
And that juror was excused, but I think that juror also had some extra legal knowledge as well. I think that did not help.
It did sound like she did, that she was aware very clearly of the burden of proof and the different ways that civil settlements go down because she had been involved in those and because of her human resources role. But one thing to point out, she was not asked directly, did you hear news of a settlement over the weekend? She was just asked if anything on her questionnaire had changed now that it's been a month plus and she is sitting here inside the courtroom. And she volunteered this information about what she heard on the radio, not just to say this is what I've heard, but also to say she no longer thinks that she could be an impartial juror, that she could bring impartiality to these proceedings.
So one thing that Eric Nelson mentioned, and he talked about the fact that the Attorney General's son is on the city council, which means he voted to approve this. The mayor is a lawyer. And we talked about this on Friday, how unusual the press conference was, because you had the plaintiffs, George Floyd's family and their attorneys, on stage with the defendants announcing this whole thing. So the message was clear that everyone from the city council to George Floyd's family, all on the same page that this officer is guilty. I mean, to me, that is super clear. And then the question is, will that impact this jury? I don't know. You know, I guess you hear that number, it's a really big number, and it's an admission of some level of liability by the city, which is really points directly to what Chauvin did.
If only all of the potential jurors, if they do see this news, and I know they'll be asked if they can set it aside, but if they could understand it like that juror who was excused for cause, that it's not guilt or innocence on the civil side, it's about liability and what's the potential exposure. And we know that if there's a case that's not as clear cut as perhaps the Muhammad Noor case, where we know that the officer fired a weapon and it killed the victim in that case, the exposure is highest for George Floyd's family before this case goes to trial, because we don't know what's going to happen. And likely that's a reason or something that was taken into consideration by those attorneys representing the family. But yes, that the optics of that for anyone watching is that the city council, all the officials are in agreement about that.
And I'm not sure, and I have to check the local laws there, but my guess is that when the city settles something, they can, we hear a lot of settlements that are like sealed and private and you never hear the numbers, but that's usually amongst private individuals or private companies. But when you have a public entity like a city, who is not taking, I mean, the mayor's not dipping into his pocket, he's just taking money from all the taxpayers to pay it out. Basically, it's got to be public. So if the settlement's reached, I don't think there's any way to keep it from the public. The only way to keep it from the public would be to do this settlement after the criminal trial. But after the criminal trial would also change some of the circumstances, right? I mean, if he came back not guilty, that's now all of a sudden a stronger case for the city to deny liability, which some people might question, might say, well, why wouldn't you wait? I mean, is it going to be more than 27 million? I mean, there's a chance that if Chauvin, if it comes back not guilty, that civil case would have gotten a little bit stronger. Obviously, if he comes back guilty, the civil case is done, but is it done more than $27 million worth of done, I guess is really the question.
In the Muhammad Noor, or the defense today, I'll say, Eric Nelson, the attorney for Derek Chauvin, he tried to make the argument that perhaps in the Muhammad Noor case, because that civil settlement was announced just a couple of hours or 24 to 48 hours after the verdict in that case, he made the assumption that they likely had already made a decision and that it didn't all come together after the verdict, but that they waited until the verdict, the guilty of third-degree murder verdict of Muhammad Noor, to release that information. No confirmation of what was going on behind the scenes. Every case is different, but that's how it was handled in that one. But we've seen it differently. For example, in the Breonna Taylor case, before the grand jury results were announced to the public, we saw just in the days before the announcement of a $12 million settlement with the family between the cities. So that was before anything was discussed or released about what was going to happen on the criminal side.
And the bottom line is, as I said off the top, these are separate cases. There's nothing wrong with making the announcement. There's nothing wrong with the settlement. You know, ultimately, as the judge said, he has no control over it. The prosecution has no control over it. So it is what it is. And at the end of the day, the only thing it could potentially be is some sort of an issue on appeal if and when Derek Chauvin is convicted. Other than that, I think we're just moving forward here.